Marilyn Monroe wanted one thing more than fame, more than money, more than respect as an actress. She wanted a baby. She wanted to be a mother so desperately that every failed pregnancy felt like proof that she didn't deserve happiness, that the universe was punishing her for something, that she was fundamentally broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. Between 1957 and 1961, Marilyn suffered at least 3 confirmed miscarriages, possibly more that weren't documented. Each one destroyed a piece of her. And the cruelest part? She blamed herself for all of them, convinced that her body was failing her the way everyone else in her life had failed her. The first miscarriage happened in the summer of 1957, when Marilyn was married to playwright Arthur Miller. She'd been so happy when she found out she was pregnant. This was going to be it, the thing that made her feel whole, the role that mattered more than any movie. She'd grown up in foster care, unwanted by her own mother, shuffled between families who saw her as a burden. Having a baby meant breaking that cycle. It meant creating the family she'd never had. It meant being the mother she'd needed and never gotten. She made it to 12 weeks. Started imagining names. Started thinking about nurseries. Started believing this was finally happening. She told close friends. She started planning how she'd balance motherhood with her career, or maybe give up the career entirely. She'd do that in a heartbeat if it meant having a baby. She started seeing herself differently in the mirror. Not Marilyn Monroe, the sex symbol, but Marilyn, the mother-to-be. It felt like the first identity she'd ever had that was truly hers, not created by Hollywood or imposed by the male gaze. And then the cramping started. The bleeding. The terror of knowing something was wrong but hoping desperately that it wasn't. Arthur rushed her to the hospital. The doctors tried to save the pregnancy, but it was too late. Her body was rejecting the baby, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. She remembers lying in that hospital bed, feeling her body expel the pregnancy, feeling the future she'd imagined dissolving into blood and pain, and knowing that this was happening to her body but she had no control over it. The helplessness was as devastating as the loss itself. The physical pain was bad. The emotional devastation was worse. Marilyn blamed herself immediately. She'd been working too hard. She'd been taking pills to sleep. She'd been stressed about her career. She'd done something wrong, and now she was being punished. The doctors tried to tell her it wasn't her fault. Miscarriages are common. They happen for many reasons. She shouldn't blame herself. But Marilyn couldn't hear that. All she could hear was that her body had failed to do the one thing she wanted most in the world. Arthur tried to comfort her, but he didn't know how. What do you say to someone whose grief is so total, so consuming? He held her while she cried. He told her they could try again. He said all the things you're supposed to say. But Marilyn was somewhere he couldn't reach, drowning in a loss that felt like confirmation of everything she'd always feared about herself. That she was unlovable, unwanted, meant to be alone. The worst part was having to go back to work. Hollywood doesn't stop for grief. She had a movie to finish, appearances to make, a career to maintain. So Marilyn put on her makeup, pasted on her smile, and performed happiness while dying inside. Everyone saw Marilyn Monroe, the sex symbol, the movie star. Nobody saw the woman whose body had just betrayed her most fundamental desire. The performance was exhausting. But what choice did she have? Show the world you're broken, and they'll use it against you. The studio didn't care about her grief. They cared about their shooting schedule. She was expected on set 3 days after leaving the hospital. 3 days to recover from losing a baby, to process grief that takes some women months or years to work through. But Marilyn Monroe had a contract, and the contract didn't include clauses for personal tragedy. So she showed up. She hit her marks. She delivered her lines. She played the sexy, carefree girl while feeling like something inside her had died. Between takes, she'd go to her trailer and cry. The makeup people would have to redo her face. Directors would get frustrated with her red eyes. Co-stars would whisper about her being difficult. Nobody knew what had happened. Or if they knew, they didn't care enough to give her the space to grieve. The show must go on. Marilyn Monroe must be Marilyn Monroe, regardless of what Norma Jean was feeling underneath. There's a particular cruelty in having to perform sexuality and desirability, when your body has just failed at its most basic biological function. Marilyn's entire career was built on her body, her curves, her face, her ability to embody male fantasy. But now that body had betrayed her in the most profound way, and she still had to offer it up for the camera, still had to make it look desirable and available, still had to pretend it was a source of joy rather than the site of devastating failure. Wait until you hear what happened next. Less than a year later, in 1958, Marilyn got pregnant again. This time she was even more careful. She cut back on pills. She tried to rest more. She prayed, even though she wasn't sure who she was praying to or if anyone was listening. She made it past the first trimester. Made it to 16 weeks. Started to believe maybe this time would be different. Started to let herself hope, and then it happened again. Another miscarriage. Another hospital. Another baby lost. Another round of doctors saying it wasn't her fault while Marilyn knew, absolutely knew that it was. Something was wrong with her. Her body was broken. She wasn't meant to be a mother. The universe was making that abundantly clear. This second loss was somehow worse than the first. Because the first time, you can tell yourself it was a fluke, a terrible thing that happened but doesn't mean anything about the future. The second time, it's a pattern. It's evidence. It's proof that your body can't do this, that you're not built for the thing you want most desperately. Marilyn's grief after the second miscarriage was deeper, darker, tinged with a hopelessness that terrified Arthur. She started talking about herself as if she was defective. "I'm not a real woman," she'd say. "Real women can have babies. I'm just broken." Arthur would try to contradict her, but Marilyn was trapped in a narrative where her inability to carry a pregnancy to term was proof of her fundamental unworthiness. She'd spent her whole childhood feeling unwanted. Now her own body was rejecting the babies she desperately wanted. The symbolism was too painful to bear. The medical reality was that Marilyn had endometriosis, a condition where tissue similar to the uterine lining grows outside the uterus, causing severe pain and fertility problems. She'd had surgery for it. She was in chronic pain, and the condition made carrying a pregnancy to term extremely difficult. But in the 1950s, endometriosis wasn't well understood. Doctors couldn't always explain why it caused miscarriages. And that lack of explanation left room for Marilyn to fill in the gaps with self-blame. The endometriosis pain itself was constant and debilitating. Marilyn would have periods so painful she couldn't get out of bed. Cramping that felt like her body was tearing itself apart from the inside. Bleeding that was heavy and irregular. And doctors in the 1950s had limited options for treating it. Surgery could remove some of the endometrial tissue, but it would grow back. Hormone treatments existed but had severe side effects. Pain medication was the main option, which meant more pills, more dependency, more problems. What made it worse was that endometriosis was often dismissed as women's problems, or even psychological. Some doctors suggested that Marilyn's pain was psychosomatic, that her anxiety was making it worse, that if she could just relax, she'd feel better. This was the 1950s medical establishment's approach to female pain, either minimize it or blame the woman for it. Marilyn knew her pain was real, knew the endometriosis was a physical condition, but still heard from doctors that maybe she was just too anxious, too neurotic, too tense, as if her body failing to carry pregnancies was somehow her fault for worrying too much about it. The connection between endometriosis and miscarriage isn't fully understood even now, but the condition affects the uterine environment in ways that can prevent proper implantation or development of a pregnancy. Marilyn's doctors probably knew the endometriosis made pregnancy difficult, but they couldn't tell her with certainty why each miscarriage happened. Was it the endometriosis? Was it stress? Was it something else? The not knowing was torture. Because if you don't know what caused the loss, you can't know how to prevent the next one. You're just hoping and praying and trying to control the uncontrollable. She also wondered if the abortion she'd had years earlier, when she was young and broke and terrified, had damaged something irreparably. She'd terminated that pregnancy because she had no money, no support, no way to care for a child. It had seemed like the only option at the time. But now she wondered if that decision had cursed her, If she was being punished for choosing not to have a baby when she was young by being unable to have one now that she desperately wanted it. The Catholic guilt, the societal shame, the whispered judgments, all of it became internalized as a belief that she didn't deserve motherhood. The guilt was irrational but overwhelming. Marilyn had absorbed all the shame society places on women who have abortions, all the judgment, all the moral condemnation. And now she was translating that shame into an explanation for why she couldn't carry a pregnancy. She didn't deserve to. She'd had her chance and made the wrong choice, and now she was paying the price. Never mind that the abortion and the miscarriages were medically unrelated. In Marilyn's mind, they were connected by a straight line of punishment. Her marriage to Arthur Miller started crumbling under the weight of this grief. They'd been so happy at first, Marilyn believing she'd finally found an intellectual equal who valued her mind. But the miscarriages revealed fault lines. Arthur didn't know how to handle Marilyn's grief. He was a man of words, but he had no words for this. And Marilyn felt increasingly isolated, trapped in pain that Arthur could sympathize with but never fully understand. You can't truly comprehend the grief of losing a wanted pregnancy unless you've experienced it yourself. But here's what makes the story even more heartbreaking. In 1958, Marilyn discovered she was pregnant for a third time. And this time, she made it further than ever before. 20 weeks, past the point where most miscarriages happen. Far enough along that she could feel movement, could imagine a future, could start to believe this baby might actually be born. She was so careful this time. Barely worked. Stayed in bed. Did everything the doctors told her to do. The third miscarriage, in December 1958, nearly destroyed her. It happened late enough in the pregnancy that it wasn't just cells and tissue anymore. It was a baby she'd bonded with, a person she'd started loving, a future she'd started planning. And losing it at that stage meant going through something closer to labor than a typical early miscarriage. The physical trauma matched the emotional devastation. After the third loss, Marilyn stopped talking about having children for a while. The hope was too painful. Every time she let herself believe it might work out, her body proved her wrong. And each loss compounded the previous ones, creating a grief so deep it affected everything. Her work suffered. Her mental health deteriorated. Her pill use increased. The depression that had always lurked in the background became overwhelming. What's the point of being Marilyn Monroe if she couldn't be the one thing that actually mattered? A mother. The public never knew about the miscarriages in detail. Marilyn's representatives would sometimes mention hospitalizations for exhaustion or gynecological issues, but the full story stayed private. Which meant Marilyn grieved publicly while pretending to be fine, smiling for cameras while dying inside, performing happiness while experiencing a loss that makes some women unable to function for months or years. The isolation of that secret grief made everything worse. There's a photo from this period, Marilyn at some Hollywood event, wearing a gorgeous gown, smiling that famous smile. And if you know what was happening in her private life, if you know that photo was taken shortly after one of the miscarriages, the smile looks different. It looks like what it is, a performance by someone who's mastered the art of hiding pain. The world wanted Marilyn Monroe the sex symbol, the star. They didn't want to know about Marilyn Monroe, the grieving would-be mother. So she gave them what they wanted and kept the rest to herself. Her relationship with Joe DiMaggio Jr., Joe's son from his first marriage, became a kind of surrogate motherhood that helped fill some of the emptiness. Joe Jr. was struggling as a teenager, dealing with the pressure of being Joe DiMaggio's son. And Marilyn, despite her own struggles, became someone he could talk to. She mothered him in ways his actual parents couldn't, sent him letters when he was at boarding school, encouraged his interests, made him feel seen and valued. For Marilyn, it was a way to express maternal love even though she couldn't have her own children. For Joe Jr., she was the one adult in his life who seemed to understand him. The irony is brutal. Marilyn would have been an amazing mother. She understood childhood trauma intimately. She knew what it felt like to be unwanted, to be moved between homes, to never feel secure. She would have fought to give her child the stability and love she'd never had. But the universe, or fate, or random biology, whatever you want to call it, denied her that opportunity. And every time Hollywood called her a dumb blonde, every time directors treated her like a body with no brain, every time the press reduced her to a sex symbol, she knew that the role she actually wanted, the identity that would have meant more to her than any movie, would never be hers. After her marriage to Arthur Miller ended in 1961, Marilyn was alone with her grief. No more chances at pregnancy, no more hope of having a biological child. She was 35, which in 1961 was considered almost too old for a first pregnancy anyway. The dream was over, and Marilyn had to figure out how to live with that loss while still being Marilyn Monroe, still performing, still being beautiful and desirable and everything the world wanted from her, even though the thing she wanted for herself was impossible. The miscarriages are often left out of Marilyn Monroe retrospectives. They're not glamorous. They don't fit the narrative of the tragic bombshell who died young. They're too uncomfortable, too female-specific, too much about biology and grief and loss that doesn't translate well to film. But they're central to understanding Marilyn's last years. The depression, the pills, the drinking, the career difficulties, all of it happened against the backdrop of this profound loss. And here's something that makes it even sadder. Marilyn blamed herself for the miscarriages, but modern medicine suggests they weren't her fault at all. Endometriosis can make pregnancy difficult or impossible. The condition isn't caused by anything the woman does. It's not punishment for past choices. It's just biology, cruel and random. But Marilyn never got to understand that. She died believing her body had failed her, that she'd been unworthy of motherhood, that she was broken in fundamental ways. The maternal instinct that Marilyn couldn't fulfill with biological children expressed itself in other ways. She mothered her friends who were struggling. She sent money to old foster families who'd fallen on hard times. She was endlessly kind to young actresses starting out in Hollywood, trying to protect them from the predators and exploitation she'd experienced. In some ways, she mothered the whole world, offering gentleness and vulnerability and emotional availability. But it wasn't enough. It couldn't fill the hole left by the children she'd never have. There's a particularly heartbreaking quote from Marilyn about children. "I've been on a calendar, but I've never been on time." It's a joke about her chronic lateness, but there's another meaning too. She was never on time for motherhood. By the time she was emotionally ready, financially stable, and desperately wanted children, her body wouldn't cooperate. By the time she had a stable marriage, she couldn't carry a pregnancy. The timing was always wrong. When you watch Marilyn Monroe movies from the late 1950s and early 1960s, you're watching someone performing through profound grief. Every smile was manufactured. Every sexy pose was exhausting. Every scene where she plays a carefree girl is someone pretending to be carefree while carrying the weight of losses nobody in the audience knows about. The performance wasn't just acting. It was survival. The third miscarriage, the late-term one, had physical consequences beyond the emotional trauma. Marilyn's body was damaged. The doctors told her future pregnancies would be even more difficult, maybe impossible. So even if she'd remarried, even if she'd tried again, the odds were vanishingly small. The door had closed, and Marilyn had to live with knowing it was closed, knowing that every month that passed took her further from any possibility, knowing that the dream was definitively over. She once said to a friend, "All I ever wanted was to be a wife and a mother. Everything else was just trying to fill the emptiness." And it's such a devastating statement because it reveals how little her fame meant to her. The world saw Marilyn Monroe, one of the most famous women who ever lived. She saw Norma Jean, the girl nobody wanted, who still couldn't have the one thing that would make her feel whole. The question that haunts anyone who knows this story: would Marilyn Monroe still have died at 36 if she'd been able to have children? Would motherhood have given her something to live for that was stronger than the depression and addiction? Would having someone who needed her have made her more careful with the pills? We can't know. But it's hard not to wonder if the loss of that dream contributed to the sense of hopelessness that characterized her final months. After the third miscarriage, Marilyn's relationship with her body became even more fraught. Her body was how she'd escaped poverty, modeling, acting, being beautiful. But her body was also what betrayed her when it mattered most. It could do everything except the one thing she actually wanted it to do. That contradiction was maddening. Her body had value to everyone except her. Hollywood wanted it. Photographers wanted it. Men wanted it. But it couldn't give her what she wanted from it, a baby. The endometriosis pain was also constant. Marilyn was in physical agony much of the time, which the public never knew about. She'd take pills for the pain, which contributed to the addiction that was already developing from the sleeping pills and anxiety medication. Her medical issues were complex and interwoven. The endometriosis, the miscarriages, the chronic pain, the depression, the anxiety, the insomnia. And all of it was treated with pills because that's what doctors did in 1960. And the pills made everything worse while seeming to help in the short term. There's also a class dimension to this story that's worth noting. Rich women in 1960 had more reproductive options than poor women, but not many more. Fertility treatments were primitive. IVF didn't exist yet. If your body couldn't carry a pregnancy, there wasn't much medicine could do. Marilyn had money and access to the best doctors, and it didn't matter. Her body wouldn't cooperate, and wealth couldn't fix that. For someone who'd clawed her way out of poverty partly by leveraging her appearance and sexuality, discovering that money and fame were useless against biology must have been devastating. The way Marilyn talked about children, when she did talk about them, was always wistful. Someday, she'd say, when things settle down, when I find the right person, when the time is right. Always pushing it into a hypothetical future. But after the third miscarriage, there was no someday. There was just the present, which didn't include children and never would. The future she'd been deferring was gone. She tried to find meaning in other things. Her acting, which she took seriously and desperately wanted respect for. Her friendships, which she poured enormous energy into. Her attempts at being a good person, generous and kind. But none of it filled the hole. None of it made her feel like her life had the purpose it would have had if she'd been able to be a mother. She was famous and beautiful and successful and profoundly, achingly empty. When Marilyn died in August 1962, she died childless and alone. The funeral that Joe DiMaggio organized was small and private, but Joe Jr. was there. The teenage boy Marilyn had mothered, the surrogate son she'd loved, the closest she'd ever come to having a child. He cried at her funeral. Years later, he'd talk about how much she'd meant to him, how she'd been the only adult who really understood him. And it's some small comfort to know that even though Marilyn never had biological children, she had a profound maternal impact on at least one young person who desperately needed her. The legacy of the miscarriages is complicated. On one hand, it's a deeply private pain that Marilyn might not have wanted publicized. On the other hand, her story resonates with millions of women who've experienced pregnancy loss, who've struggled with infertility, who've had their bodies fail them when they wanted nothing more than to be mothers. Marilyn's grief is their grief. Her sense of broken failure is their sense of broken failure. And knowing that even Marilyn Monroe, with all her beauty and fame and success, couldn't make her body cooperate, maybe that's a strange kind of comfort. It wasn't personal. It wasn't punishment. It was just biology being cruel and random. If Marilyn Monroe had lived, if she'd made it past 36, would she have adopted? Would she have found other ways to express maternal love? Would she have made peace with being childless, or would the grief have followed her forever? We can't know. What we do know is that in her last years, the absence of children was a wound that never healed. A loss that compounded every other loss. A dream that died before she did. The 3 confirmed miscarriages, possibly more, represent 3 times Marilyn Monroe let herself hope. Let herself believe that maybe this time things would work out. Let herself imagine a future that included the thing she wanted most. And 3 times her body said no. Her body, which had been used and exploited and objectified her entire adult life, refused to give her the one thing she actually wanted from it. And Marilyn, who'd survived childhood trauma and Hollywood exploitation and multiple terrible marriages, couldn't survive that final betrayal. When people talk about why Marilyn Monroe died so young, they focus on the pills, the depression, the Hollywood pressure, and all of that mattered. But they often leave out this part. She died a woman whose most fundamental dream had been definitively destroyed. She died knowing she'd never be a mother. She died knowing that the one role she actually wanted, the identity that would have meant more than Marilyn Monroe movie star, was impossible. And maybe, just maybe, that loss of hope contributed to the loss of will to keep fighting. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. Have you experienced loss that others couldn't see? Have you had to perform being okay while grieving privately? How do you make peace with dreams that can't come true? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe for more stories about the private pain behind public faces, the losses that shape us, and the grief we carry in silence. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story.